If you've watched any amount of TV in the past few decades, you may have noticed the growing prevalence of irony. We find tactics of genre play, parody, self-reference, and irreverence not only in the way our culture tells stories on TV, but in the way our culture sells products on TV too. Think of the Old Spice commercial, in which we see diamonds cascading down from a $3 bottle of body wash. A Doritos commercial that chronicles the ill-fated relationship of a man and his goat who has an apparently insatiable appetite for seasoned tortilla chips. And then a Clear Eyes commercial featuring Ben Stein mordantly droning on through a sarcastic product demo on a beach ball. Now, I think a lot of people take for granted that these are perfectly normal ways of selling a product nowadays. So normal, in fact, that they scarcely even register consciously with us as ironic. So in this presentation, I try to address the nature and causes of irony in modern television advertising head-on. Specifically, I'll argue that the growing prevalence of irony in modern TV advertising can be seen as a response to something called the implosion of meaning in the media. So I want to structure our discussion in terms of three core questions. First, what is the implosion of meaning in the media? And how exactly does it come about, chronologically and psychologically? Second, what's the function of the ironic frame or ironic features in a modern television advertisement? How are advertisers using irony to achieve some kind of desired effect? And third, how should we as critical consumers of media react to the ascendance of the ironic frame in television advertising? So one thing that might help orient us towards the question of an implosion of meaning is to wonder, generally speaking, well, what is an implosion? Well, an implosion is a process in which objects are destroyed by collapsing on themselves, like we see with this building in the background. So what exactly is the implosion of meaning in the media? Well, it's a process in which more and more information results in less and less meaning. This is exactly what French philosopher and cultural critic Jean Baudrillard argues has already happened in our media culture. We're constantly exposed to mediated information through print, radio, television, and the web. And for him, this amounts to a relentless accumulation of text and images that's impossible for a single viewer, a single interpretant, to keep track of in earnest. The catchphrase he uses is that information devours its own content. Very provocative. But we should be wondering in all this kind of abstraction and theorizing, how exactly does the implosion of meaning come about? And when it does, what does it look like? Now, to answer that, we need to align ourselves with Baudrillard's approach to cultural explanation. And Baudrillard's approach is something called historical materialism. Now, the historical materialist wants to explain the character and development of a human society in terms of something more basic, something more fundamental. And for a Marxist like Baudrillard, that's economic activity. Now, the idea is that in a modern society, economic principles of standardization, maximization, efficiency, and preference satisfaction are going to do a significant amount of explanatory work in telling the right kind of story about how a given trend in mass culture comes to be. Now, clearly these principles apply to material goods, but it's about symbolic goods too. Baudrillard was insistent about this, that patterns of industrialism, which necessarily are going to involve the production of material goods, could not persist without the simultaneous mass production of accompanying meanings, or symbolic goods. And by mass production of meanings, you may have guessed, I mean advertising. So it seems like basically the goal of advertising is to focus public attention on a given product or brand, presumably with a secondary goal of affecting consumption habits. But the kind of public attention an advertisement seeks to affect, and the tactics the ad uses to achieve this effect, are variable. They're subject to the fluctuating attitudes of its audience, and also to the characteristics of the broader media landscape. So in order to explain how the tactic of irony creeps into modern television advertising, we need to trace the development of television advertising itself. So the first stage we'll look at is what I'll call correspondence. This is simply when the advertisement aligns the symbolic meaning of the product that it seeks to convey directly with the functional aspects of the product. You can think of this as the straight sell. Buy my product because it does the job best. Let's take a look at an example of this, a Band-Aid commercial from the 1950s.
Look, here is the new Band-Aid plastic strip with new Super Stick. It sticks better than any other bandage. The proof? Take a dry egg at room temperature. Touch the egg with any other bandage. Brand X, brand Y, brand Z. Not one sticks. But a Band-Aid plastic strip with new Super Stick sticks tight instantly. Watch it again in slow motion. No pressure, yet we can lift the egg, even boil it. And the Band-Aid plastic strip never comes loose.
Maybe you don't want to broil eggs this way, but you do want the extra protection of Band-Aid plastic strips. They take better care of little cuts and scratches. They stay put.
Yes, even in hot, soapy dishwater. Neat, fresh-colored, almost invisible. Band-Aid plastic strips with new Super Stick stick better than any other bandage. Made only by Johnson & Johnson, the most trusted name in surgical dressings. Be sure you get Band-Aid plastic strips.
The correspondence features are really what's most salient in this ad. It seems like a pretty forthright, functional attempt to persuade you, the viewer, to buy this product. We're given a bunch of explicit reasons to agree that this is really the case. The carefully crafted side-by-side product demo, the slow-motion replay, they're all aiming at some correspondence between the meaning of the ad and the real functional advantages, or the purported functional advantages of the product. So, the correspondence relation, clearly present in this ad. But it's important to notice that this ad isn't without subversive elements. And we're also explicitly told that we want the extra protection of Band-Aid plastic strip. This is a rather prosaic example of what Baudrillard refers to as the act of staging desire in the media. The ad is simulating an exchange of meanings and attitudes. It's simulating communication. The message is augmented even further because it comes from what I'll call an ideal agent, right? An attractive housewife. They're using this image to exploit the audience's own desire for a certain self-image, a certain lifestyle. Now, to capture these more subversive elements of an ad, we need a different model. And I'll call that augmentation, right? This is when the material good at hand is augmented or elevated from its status as a mere functional object by assigning to it a symbolic meaning that isn't essential to the object itself. Now, in the Band-Aid ad, augmentation is the relationship between the bandage and the attractive housewife, right, who tells you you want the extra protection of this product. Now, we still don't have enough subversion, enough augmentation to engender an implosion of meaning. But the next example we'll look at, McDonald's ad from the early 70s, might just get us there. Let's watch.
You're the one. Growing up now, Mary Ryan, you're the one. Sometimes school is really trying, getting notes about the guy you like, but he doesn't notice you. Seems he's never gonna stop, and there's nothing you can do. You're the one, trying for that special look now. you're the one. Oh, why'd he have to look now? Then just when you gave up and you're stopping by our place, guess who else is dropping in to see your smiling face? At McDonald's, we do it all for you.
We do it all for you. What a wonderful refrain. Well, we might ask, what exactly is this ad doing? Well, it's preying on a variety of teenage hopes, fears, insecurities, and aspirations to tell the viewer, now listen, McDonald's isn't just a burger joint. It's the literal location of your social and emotional self-actualization. And so McDonald's, they don't want to just sell you on their fast, filling, and tasty sandwiches, right? Everyone can do fast, filling, and tasty. Everyone can do functional. Instead, McDonald's wants to augment their brand with this symbolic narrative, a teenage romance sung to you in the second person. Now, to understand how we arrive at the implosion of meaning from tactics like this, imagine iterating this kind of encounter with a calculated, symbolic act of augmentation hundreds, if not thousands of times per week. Right? It's difficult, to accomplish this synchronically, right, in real time. So what I've done next is I've compiled a list of these kinds of slogans to get us thinking in the right way about the possible effects of constant exposure to such tactics of persuasion and dreams made real, making great things possible, the closest thing to home. What you get, or what you want, is what you get. It's what we're made of. Be all that you can be. Have it your way. When you care enough, just do it. What these slogans all have in common is an attempt to elevate, to augment the meaning of some brand or product to the level of fantasy, wish fulfillment, identity, self-actualization, security, and freedom. But these appeals really aren't experienced by the viewer in isolation. Rather, they arrive as part of a relentless accumulation of information, right? Thousands of times per week. Now, on Baudrillard's view, this leads directly to the implosion of meaning, because whatever these messages are getting at is absorbed by this endless stream of information. But I think the problem with Baudrillard's view of the implosion is that it assigns virtually no interpretive or reactive role to the viewer herself. The direct move from accumulation to implosion renders the viewer a kind of passive receptacle of information. But I don't think that's plausible. Instead, I'm proposing that constant exposure to these tactics brings about a sense that these messages are transparent, hollow in their attempts to take advantage of her, and in this regard they constitute a kind of affront to her dignity. Now, this isn't to say she forms this judgment, right, that the advertisements constitute an affront to her dignity through any kind of deliberate, conscious process of reflection. But I want to say that after continual attempts at persuasion and enticement, she at least puts up a pre-reflective guard against such tactics, right? They strike her at some point as specious, hollow, and inauthentic. It's not just the lofty slogans, the just do it or we do it all for you, but it's also the paid actor testimonials that mimic a word-of-mouth recommendation, or the pharmaceutical company that promotes its new line of products under the guise of a public service announcement. After repeated encounters with these messages, attempts by commercial media to impart meaning are now filtered necessarily through the viewer's anticipatory detachment, through her presumed distance from the possibility of meaning in the media itself. And this posture of distance and detachment is precisely the embodied moment of the implosion of meaning in the media. As Baudrillard would say, information devours its own content, where it's in virtue of this accumulation of information that its content fails in the first place to penetrate the viewer's guard and reveal itself in any meaningful way. Now, clearly, this poses a problem for advertisers and firms that are producing goods. But when we look at irony in advertising, we'll see how a message can take advantage of the very conditions that give rise to the implosion of meaning. So, the question, how do we arrive at the ascendance of irony in advertising? Well, here's how I think it works. Once the viewer presumes this anticipatory detachment from hollow, artificial attempts at meaning, she develops a countervailing preference for advertisements that make no attempt to masquerade as meaningful in the first place. And this is precisely what the ironic advertisement does. It abandons the pretense of a message as such, right? It avails itself of the viewer's information exhaustion by defensively getting rid of this goal of delivering functional messages or augmenting itself to the level of authentic self-actualization. So, while in the unironic advertisement, information is fated to devour its own content in virtue of the implosion of meaning, the ironic advertisement works by deliberately expurgating itself of such content before it can be so devoured. And in so doing, the advertisement signals an interesting kind of consonance or solidarity with the viewer through a kind of ironic nod, an acknowledgement that this message, unlike the others, shares the viewer's cynical attitude about the hackneyed enterprise of advertising itself. But enough theory. Let's see how this plays out in practice.
The Toyota Yaris comes in a range of 8 colors, like black, white, silver, other silver, blue, other blue, yellow, no, other blue, and red, and red, and red.
So let's investigate how irony operates in this ad. Now first, it deliberately and repeatedly breaks the rhythm of a sleek, polished, modern car advertisement. Right? The salesman establishes this kind of sales cadence only to violate it himself by suggesting a color that he apparently knows isn't being offered for the Yaris. Then his cadence is obstructed by these technical difficulties with the color of red not showing up on screen. And the effect is an ironic comment on the conventional craft and artifice of a modern car commercial, because this ad presents us with a message revealing itself deliberately as artifice. Right? So in exposing itself as totally groundless before it can be so exposed, it's signaling a kind of consonance with us, with our attitudes.
For dry, red eyes, clear eyes is awesome. It removes redness and has an ingredient to moisturize. Wow. The difference is clear eyes.
Before I saw this ad, I didn't know it was humanly possible to sound as emphatically uninterested in a product demonstration as Ben Stein does here. And also, in this kind of deliberately ridiculous Hawaiian print shirt, he's clearly not supposed to be construed as an ideal agent. And furthermore, the demonstration itself is conspicuously saying nothing about the effectiveness of the Clear Eyes formula. Contrast this kind of mentally with the Band-Aid ad, and the kind of transformation we're dealing with in tactics should be clear. So let's go on to discuss the function of the ironic frame. So comparative literature professor at Princeton says that the ironic frame amounts to a preemptive acknowledgement of the ad's own failure to accomplish anything meaningful. Now, in this way, she thinks irony is a kind of defense mechanism, a kind of guard against criticism. But I want to say that the ironic ad doesn't just have a negative goal, to avoid being mocked by the viewer. It really has a positive goal, too, to disclose itself to the viewer as the thing doing the mocking. Now, for this reason, I think it's better to think of this sort of irony as a gesture of protest, as an attempt to vocalize cynical attitudes that its viewers already hold about the enterprise of advertising itself. In the post-war period, talk about consumerism, conformity, and the banality of mass-produced culture became routine elements of American middle-class life. What the ironic advertisement does is it simply avails itself of the attitudes present in this discourse by signaling some kind of consonance with them. Now on to our final question. How should we, as somewhat critical consumers of media, react to the rise of the ironic frame? One way to go is to simply embrace it as a kind of negative authenticity. We appreciate the ironic ad because it attempts to destabilize worn-out conventions by brazenly flaunting its own ironic awareness. Baudrillard himself thought that the best strategy of resistance to the implosion of meaning would be the refusal of meaning altogether. Now, prima facie, it might seem that the ironic advertisement's candid proclamations of its own meaninglessness are aligned in some way with this strategy that Baudrillard sets forth, this strategy of the refusal of meaning. But this is precisely the interpretation the ironic advertisement itself hopes to suggest. And that's why I think it's precisely the interpretation we ought to refuse. Instead, we should recognize that the ironic advertisement is mass production, offering up a demonstrably self-serving apology for its own destructive effects, in the interests of its own industrial demands. In this way, the ironic advertisement seeks to thrive on the illusion of liberation from its genre's own worn-out pretenses, on the illusion of taking a political stance about the homogenizing mechanics of multinational capitalism. But these are rightly called illusions, because the ironic advertisement still is and must be situated within the productive logic of late-phase capitalism, right? Despite its pretensions of disruption, destabilization, and rebellion, the ironic advertisement is, at bottom, an instrument of profit maximization just the same. Perhaps this, too, will accumulate and give rise to its own implosion. To conclude, I want to highlight the possibility of a silver lining. Now, insofar as commercial messages are beholden to consumer preferences, we might think that the ascendance of irony has a bright side after all. It means that people are growing tired of what unchecked consumerism has wrought on our media culture. The growth of ironic advertising is, to some degree, indicative of a change in our cultural attitudes and symbolic preferences. And we might think that if this change continues, it could result in the emergence of a new cultural landscape, one that's critically aware of its own cultural logic and pretenses. Now, Baudrillard has a response to this, and that's that any such vision of positive cultural development or transformation is a delusion. It's a fantastic wish that's actually imposed on us by the linear logic of the industrial system itself. Right? So Baudrillard thinks that these visions of progress make the fatal assumption that we, as the subjects of our culture, have any kind of sovereign control over the objects of that culture. Instead, Baudrillard thinks we should forgo the project of progress altogether and just stare in stupefied awe at the catastrophe unfolding. In making this argument, I think Baudrillard is forgetting a crucial conclusion of his own approach, historical materialism. Cultural transformations don't require that the subjects of a culture have any kind of sovereign control over the culture to which they're subject. It simply requires that the culture industry is sensitive to any changes in consumer attitudes and preferences, even unintended changes. If I'm right that the growth of irony in advertising is a result of perhaps an unintended change in consumer attitudes, then the industry really is responsive to our reactions and subject to the constraints those reactions impose on the kinds of meanings and the kinds of information they can manufacture. Thank you. I look forward to our discussion.